This lesson is attachment. We're looking at animals, studies of attachment. This is paper 1, along with memory, social and psychopathology. We're going to look at animal studies of attachment in today's lesson. The two people that we need to be aware of are Lorenz and Harlow, and we need to know the procedure and the findings and conclusions of their research. Lorenz is the first study we'll look at. So Lorenz had some gosling eggs. He divided them into two groups. One group was left with their natural mother and the other group was put in an incubator. Then he waited for them to hatch and observed their behaviour. He found that the incubator eggs hatched and they attached to the first living thing that they saw, which was Lorenz. They followed him around everywhere. There are images of Lorenz swimming in his lake and the little geese are following him. The control group, however, they imprinted or attached to their natural mother and followed their natural mother around. They actually got the goslings and they mixed them up to see who they would go to and who they would follow, and they found that even after they had been mixed up, the goslings from the incubator saw Lorenz and they followed him and they did not recognise their natural mother. In conclusion, each group of goslings had attached or imprinted on the first moving thing that they saw. And imprinting is a process that is very similar to attachment. What it does is it binds an animal to a caregiver and they have a special relationship. Lorenz believed that this imprinting was very important and it had to happen within a critical time period, but this critical time period differed. For some it was hours and for some it was weeks. So within a couple of hours, say if a chick hadn't imprinted, then it was going to have negative effects on them and they wouldn't be able to imprint to anybody else. Next we've got Harlow and Harlow's monkeys. So Harlow had two wire monkeys. One was wrapped in a cloth, the other had milk, and then there was a third wire monkey that had a cloth and a milk bottle. There were 8 monkeys and they split the monkeys into 2 groups. The first group had a wire monkey with a cloth around it and a food bottle. The second group had a wire monkey with a cloth or a wire monkey with food. They found that the monkeys spent most of their time with the cloth covered wire monkey, whether this had food or not, and when they were in the condition where they had the cloth or the milk, they would just go to get food, and as soon as they had their food they would go straight back to the cloth mother. When the monkeys were frightened, they would go to the cloth mother. When they were playing with new objects, they would use the cloth mother as a secure base, so they would keep one foot on the cloth covered mother for reassurance, or they would keep going back to the cloth covered mother. So this study by Harlow shows that infants do not just develop an attachment to the person or the monkey that provides them with food. Actually, comfort is more important, it's more valued by infants than food in terms of attachments. So it's contact comfort, which this study shows is important. Harlow's research can be used throughout this topic. So we can use Harlow's research to go against learning theory, which is the next lesson in this series, and we can use it to support this idea of Bowlby saying that there's specific monotropic bond and it's not just based on food, it's based on something else as well. As this idea of comfort, which is very, very important, and we can use it to support Schaefer and Emerson's research, which we looked at last week in terms of stages of attachment, because Schaefer and Emerson actually found that it wasn't just the person that provided the food to an infant that they had an attachment with. It was actually more to do with the quality of care that they were given, not just how much care they were given. That was important in terms of the development of attachment. Further to Harlow's research, they actually did a follow-up study, so this is the bit that you can use to support Bowlby. They found that the monkeys that didn't have a mother and that were part of this study, when they were put in their normal situation, so when they were put back with other monkeys, they froze or they fled when they were approached by another monkey because they didn't know how to react or interact with that other monkey. They were also sexually abnormal, and when they had children, or baby monkeys, they didn't cradle their own babies, so they didn't know how to care for their own infants. And this supports this idea of Bowlby's theory that you have to have this special bond, because this special bond teaches you a lot, and it gives you an internal working model which teaches you how to interact with other people and how to form attachments with other people. So if they'd have had their mother normally, then their mother would have taught them how to interact with other monkeys, and their mother would have taught them how to care for their own babies, because they would have a script in their head of how their mother cared for them, and they would therefore apply that kind of like a schema when they had their own babies. But because the monkeys didn't have that maternal figure that provided them with all of this additional information, they weren't able to develop an internal working model because they didn't have a monotropic bond. Also, they found that the monkeys that spent time with their peers before they were 3 months old were actually okay. So if the monkeys in part of this study, some of them they put back into a normal situation with other monkeys before they were 3 months, and these monkeys didn't have as many issues. So this links to this idea of a critical period, kind of like what Lorenz said. Like, it's really important that you form an attachment early on, because if you don't form an attachment early on, it's going to have a long-term effect. So it might be that there's a time period where you can develop a specific bond with somebody, and you can develop an attachment, and you can learn from this attachment, and if it passes that time, then this can't happen and this can have negative effects. So Bowlby also looked at maternal deprivation, and this is where you are separated from that maternal figure for a short period of time, and you can link this research, so Harlow's research in particular, this follow-up aspect, this follow-up study from Harlow, you can use that to support Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation later in the topic. So, just to recap, we have 2 studies, Lorenz and Harlow. Lorenz, it was geese, separated them into 2 groups, one with Lorenz, one with the natural mother, and they found that the geese imprinted on the person that they saw first, or object that they saw first, so whether that was their natural mother or Lorenz. Harlow, with his monkeys, found that the monkeys preferred comfort over food, and the study had a negative effect on the development of the monkeys because they didn't have a mother, they didn't learn how to develop attachments with other monkeys, and they didn't learn how to care for their own infants when they had babies. Then we have some issues with both of the studies with ethics and generalisability. So because it's animal research, there's a lot of ethical issues involved here. With regards to Lorenz, if he wasn't able to provide long-term care, this could have an impact on them. He can't teach geese everything that they need to know. He can't teach them how to fly. So how are they going to manage that? It could have a long-term effect on the geese themselves. And then if we think about Harlow's monkeys, it was a terrible situation that these monkeys were put in, and it had long-term effects on them and their development. So there's lots of ethical issues there. Then generalisability, because both of the studies are on animals, and I know we mention this a lot in psychology, the research is difficult to apply to humans because humans and animals have different cognitions. rhesus monkeys are more similar to humans than geese. So it might be that Harlow's research is easier to generalise because biologically we have some similarities, whereas with the geese we have even less similarities, so that might be even more difficult to apply to humans. But even though the generalisability is difficult, there are some advantages of using this research, and when we do apply it, we can use it to help us, which I'll discuss later on. So we've got some evaluation points. So a good thing is that there's lots of other studies that support this research of imprinting. So I have one here where chicks who were exposed to yellow rubber gloves for feeding during their first few weeks became imprinted on the gloves. And he also found that male chickens tried to mate with the glove, showing that imprinting is linked to reproductive behaviour. So imprinting might also have sexual and mating implications. So for example, in this study, the chicks who had imprinted on a rubber glove, and therefore they thought that that was what they had to mate with in order to reproduce. So it can have impacts on that, and that could be kind of like when we're talking about ethics, that could be like a long-term issue with Lorenz. They could try and mate with Lorenz and not other geese, and it could have long-term effects on them. I've just discussed the generalisability, but we do see that Harlow's research is supported by Schaefer and Emerson, so it does show that we can generalise it to humans, and you could say that also Harlow's research is supported by Bowlby's theory of the critical period and Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. So again, although it's hard to generalise the animal studies, we can see some similarities between animal and human research, or behaviours, sorry. Then we've got a further evaluation, and this is just going back over that idea of ethics. So even though there's ethical issues with the research, and Harlow's study in particular is very controversial, there are some benefits of this research, and we can justify it because it has had a significant impact on our understanding of attachment, and we've used it to offer better care for infants, which I'll discuss in a minute. So it's this idea that there's a cost-benefit analysis that we need to carry out. So the costs to these 8 monkeys and their lives, can that be outweighed by the benefits to society from this research? And in your second year research methods, you'll look at ethical issues and social sensitivity in a lot more detail, and it's just this idea that we always need to consider like a cost-benefit analysis of research. What are the costs to the animals, and are the benefits to humans going to be outweighed by that? So to recap our evaluation, we have research support showing that animals imprint on objects. We have generalisability and ethics, which are negative issues. However, with regards to generalisability, we can see that some animal behaviours are mirrored in humans. So we've got Bowlby's theory and maternal deprivation, and we can see similarities between that. I think there's a study by Quinton later on that we'll look at, and that shows that women who are brought up in care struggled to care for their own infants. So you can see that that's kind of a similarity that we have between Harlow and monkey behaviour and human behaviour. And then we have the ethical issue, but it can be outweighed by the benefits to society. So there's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis that needs to take place. Real-life application, this can come under your evaluation also. So Harlow's research has helped social care workers. It helps us understand how to care for infants, particularly infants that are in the care system, or infants who are going to be away from their mothers for a prolonged period of time. Even giving advice to future parents. At one stage, so in the 1950s, the advice was to have as little contact with the infant as possible when caring for them. So you would just pick them up to feed them, and then you would put them straight back down. If you go on the internet, you can find like child rearing practices from the 1950s, and some of them suggest that you push your baby outside in the pram and you leave your baby outside for as long as possible during the day, and you would leave your baby to cry. You wouldn't pick your baby up and you wouldn't comfort your baby. So that was common practice or common advice in the 1950s. But when Harlow's research came out, it kind of made people think, and it made people realise that comfort is just as important as just your basic care. So it's really important to pick babies up and to play with them and to give them your attention and give them love and affection, as well as just giving them food and doing the basics of care. And it's really important for this to happen if the child is to have a normal development, and if that child is to be able to form attachments later on in life. This, along with Bowlby's research, kind of changed the care system, and other people such as Robertson changed the care system and made people realise that it's really important to provide comfort to infants, to help and to start to develop that attachment with infants as early as possible. So yeah, we'll mention that quite a lot throughout this topic, like the importance of developing attachments early on. So like you can link that to the critical period. So, and if an infant's born into the care system, then they will seek to get that infant adopted as early as possible, or put them in like a long-term foster home for as long as early as possible, to help them develop that bond and develop that attachment, so they can develop normally and form attachments and know how to care for their babies when they get older. So just to recap that, real life application, you can use it as your evaluation or as part of your evaluation, and this idea that Harlow's research in particular has had an impact on the care system. So before this, the advice in the 50s was leave your baby to cry, don't pick your baby up, don't provide comfort to your baby, whereas Harlow's research would say that comfort is equally and kind of emotionally more important than just feeding your baby. So now we have some exam questions. So I've got 2 short exam questions that I'd like you to try now. So there's 8 marks there, and that should take you about 10 minutes. And these are just examples of questions, and it's the idea that you need to make sure that you are aware of the research studies in lots of detail. And then you can plan an essay and you can attach that and hand it in, and I'll have a look through, or you could try and answer the question, outline and evaluate research into animal studies of attachment. So have a go at that. Okay, so we'll go through the mark scheme for the first question. Have a look here. It's just the procedure. So if you've discussed findings, you don't get any marks for the findings whatsoever. You just have to discuss the procedure. So you would have to say Harlow had wire and cloth mother. You could talk about the further research where he observed the monkeys with their babies or with other monkeys and their peers. Lorenz imprinting research and looking at the geese. So you can see it's measured on a scale, so you want to be aiming for level 2, and you have to make sure that it's logically sequenced and it makes sense, so it's not muddled. You've got your keywords in there. In Lorenz, you've got the idea that he observed the geese. That's something that people miss out. So the idea that he actually observed the geese after he split them up. He observed them to see who they would follow and how they would behave. And the same with Harlow. Harlow would observe the monkeys, and that's a key part of the procedure, is that idea that they would observe, and often people miss that bit out. So they'll talk about the cloth and the wire mothers, but then they won't say what he actually did then, and that he actually observed and wrote down and videoed what happened and looked for patterns in their behaviour, etc. Then for the second question, which was a limitation, you could have had generalisability, which is extrapolation to attachment in humans, so it might not apply, and this can link to the next bit, which is like nature and complexity of the bond. So we don't know how important particular bonds are, so like especially with imprinting, you don't necessarily know how important that bond is. You don't know if they can make bonds with other animals in the near future and still be okay, etc. Okay, you might have spoken about ethics as well, ethics is probably the other one that you discussed in terms of limitation of the research, because the advantages are obviously application and other research support. So now what I would like you to do is do the next lesson and then do the weekly quiz. If you have any questions or you want any help, then please just add it onto the comments on Classroom or email me. Have a go at the the essay plan, and if you want to have a go at the question, you can send that to me as well. Thank you.